me, the Nutty Professor. I last spoke to you about a month ago when we finished the last series, podcast from the Edge. And in that last episode, I said that I'd had a couple of falls and I was going to continue trying to turn back, struggling with addictive issues, but I was going to do it privately. But I did say, and I said it in the form of Arnold Schwarzenegger, I did say, I'll be back. And here I am. I've survived. Now, I did. And in that podcast, I said that I might end up going into the abyss for a while, but the trick would be to come back to the edge and then start pulling away from the edge, inching back from the edge to slightly safer ground. So it'll be more difficult to keep falling over into the abyss. And in that last podcast, I did use a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche about the abyss and staring into abyss and so on. And I had the opportunity to get out of that world. An opportunity presented itself, and I managed to slip out as a cat. I have 9 lives. I think I've used up several of them, but I think I used up one more life, so we're down to maybe 1 or 2 lives left. So the Nutty Professor cat has to be very careful now. Not a lot of spare lives. But I slipped out. I came up from the abyss, pulled myself up, and I'd kind of parachuted into the abyss, and then I pulled myself out of it. And I was at the edge for a while, and I'm still sort of at the edge, but I'm now, this next series is going to be about my inching away from the edge. In PATAP terms, in my personalized approach, this is there's going to be a lot of recycling, rechanneling of energy, channeling the energy towards more productive, things such as reading, writing, seeing movies, doing podcasts, and there'll be I've mentioned, I'm very fortunate in that I do have a car collection, sort of put together with my father, but it's entirely mine now. And I'm spending some time with the cars. I take some cruises. I might show them in one of the podcasts or 1 or 2 of the cars. I might even go looking for another car. It'll be car number 8. So, and maybe you guys can come with me. It'll be be fun. There's something I want to talk about here. I am shooting this in my home, not in a studio. And I'm in a chair that I call the ego chair. Now, the reason I call this chair the ego chair is that I sit in this when I'm battling my cravings. So when the cravings are really strong and they're 1 minute at a time, 1 hour at a time, I sit here and I battle. Now, while I'm sitting, and I've mentioned this in previous podcasts, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but while I'm sitting in this, I do have, from my system, I have totems and symbols. So this is one of the symbols I have mentioned in previous podcasts. This is Bast, the Egyptian cat goddess, and I'd keep it here on the armrest. And then another one, this is a laughing Buddha. Now, you know that I don't take these things literally, and in a previous podcast, I did tell the Buddha to F off. However, they're symbolic, and when I'm battling cravings, I sit here sometimes, and I have my Buddha figurine, I have my Bast the cat. I won't ask these symbols to take away my cravings the way that the 12 steppers do. I want to talk a little bit about this ego chair. Now, I am using the word ego here, the concept, in the more Freudian and to a certain degree Jungian contexts. The word itself, ego, comes from the Latin word for I, and you've probably heard of the Latin phrase, ego cogito sum, I think, therefore I am. Now, the use of the term ego in Freudian theory is relatively positive. because in Freud's framework, the tripartite, 3 parts, in Freud's framework, there is a self is divided. There isn't really a self. It's fragmented. There's constant conflict. So the mediator is the ego, So you've got the id going, and it comes from the word for it, It was actually first coined by George Grodek, and then Freud adapted it. So it, id, for Freud is instincts, He called it the seething cauldron. It's like, I want it now, whether it is a substance or even a sip of Coca-Cola. It's like, I don't want to wait until the filming is over. I want my Coke, I want it now. That's the id, The superego is the opposite. The superego is you can't have it, whatever it is, even Coca-Cola. The superego is going, it's bad for you. The shit they put in that, and the caffeine and sugar, you should stop drinking Coke completely. So that's the battle. It's like, I want it now, you can't have it at all. And the ego is in the middle. It's trying to placate. It's both of those, And that's where the ego comes up with mechanisms, ego defense mechanisms. So the ego in Freudian theory is both conscious and unconscious. And if there is a center of personality for Freud, it is the ego. For Jung, the ego is entirely conscious, and it's in control in sort of the first half of life, separating from the parents, finding a partner, getting a job, all of that stuff. That's ego stuff, But the second half of life, you're moving towards the true center, and the true center, and it's not given for Jung. The true center is the self, and the self you have to strive towards. The self is making the unconscious conscious. So the different aspects of personality for Jung, you've got the shadow, which we've talked about in previous podcasts, the dark side. And you don't just repress it, you acknowledge it, You don't necessarily give into it, but you rechannel it, and you integrate it. So you've got the shadow, you've got the anima, feminine side of the male personality, animus, masculine side of the female personality. Persona! We've talked about before. My persona as the nutty professor, Now, I've also lately come across, and in discussions with people in junkie world, and when partying, these topics come up because I'm now known for my podcasts, and sometimes when I'm out in that world, somebody shows my podcast, and it becomes like a conversation piece, and we have discussions. And one of the people that I was partying with had come across the term ego, but in a very negative sense, because she keeps playing this clip from a movie. It's a very weird film. It's an action film with Jason Statham, and I'd seen it some years ago, and I've seen these clips again in that kind of odd context in the underworld. But the last part of the movie is people, academics, and people from meditation world and so on, talking about the concept of ego, and this includes the very well-known Deepak Chopra, But they're talking about ego, but they talk about ego as very negative. And that's the way we use it very often in everyday language, because we say somebody is egocentric, And you see, the root of that is the Latin term I. Somebody is focused only on I, So in Buddhist framework, and in Chopra's framework, the ego is seen as selfish, and limiting growth and potential actualization and oneness, the Atman and the Brahman. Again, I'm not going to go into all of this, but these are concepts. For me, the ego is a positive thing, because when I sit in this chair and I'm battling the id instincts, the id cravings, the I want it now, I am trying to become conscious of them. of the shadow, where it's coming from, and the dangers of giving into that and not being able to come back, and the ego is aware of that, in Freudian terms. Now, there is another related concept from Freud, and I will probably come back to this in a later concept, in a later podcast, but this is the concepts of Eros and Thanatos. Now, Eros are life instincts, and there's two aspects to this. There's the life of the individual, so you need food, water, oxygen, all of that stuff, otherwise you'll die, survival, and that's why sexuality is so powerful for Freud, because for Freud, Eros is also, and we get the term erotic, it's sexual stuff, survival of the species, not of the individual. But for Freud, all of this stuff is mixed together at first, so those are life instincts. But he added, because after World War I, and he saw all the destruction and, people killing each other, dying, and he's like going, something's wrong with my theory. Because if all we're born with is life instincts and procreation, sexual instincts, why does aggression exist? Why does war exist? Why do people do things that are, self-destructive, And, junkies particularly do a lot of self-destructive stuff, very Thanatos motivated, So he added, he said, there's also death instincts. Thanatos is the Greek word for death, So there's a struggle between those two, So that's the Freudian theory. Now, we will come back to some of this in later podcasts. Since I have mentioned the ego chair, there is a precedent of using chairs in psychological frameworks, and there's a psychologist named Fritz Perls, and he's a Gestalt psychologist, and he had a technique where you'd be sitting in this chair, and then there's an empty chair across from you, and you would address either important people from your life, a parent, possibly a deceased parent or a partner or something. You address them, or you address an aspect of yourself, Now, he wouldn't use the term id or inner child or anything like that, but you address an aspect of, yourself from the past, or who you want to be, or a negative aspect of yourself, or a positive aspect of yourself. You can address it in that chair. I've never actually, been involved in that form of therapy, but I've been told that it can get pretty aggressive at times, Now, what I'm going to end this with is that this next series of podcasts, I'm going to try to start inching back from the edge, And I will mention some of my own struggles from time to time, but I won't go into a lot of personal details, I want to talk about, books, movies, psychological concepts, and I will give personal examples from time to time, of course, music videos, and I might even talk a bit about cars and show some of my cars, because that's one of my rechanneling of energies. Better than the other addictions, safer, less chance of a heart attack, The car's always there, so we'll sell it later. So it's nice to be back. Nice to see you all again, and I'll see you next week. Bye from the Nutty Professor.